Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I am talking about my second week in December, my weekly reads, and we're full into winter, although I would say it was winter a while ago. This is the first snowstorm that I've driven through, so a milestone. And of course, because it was a snowstorm, not even yet that the snow had melted and become black ice, we have all the people on the roads that are driving either precariously fast or slow, endangering people no matter how long you live here and no matter how many months or winter. We always have the people that don't know how to drive properly, and then the next day there's like derelict cars on the sides of the road and things. So yeah, milestones. I read, I think, 11 books this time, so let's go through them. Hopefully I'll be quick. Life in the City of Dirty Water, a memoir of healing by Clayton Thomas-Muller. I give this 3 stars. It is exactly what it says it is on the tin. It uses non-linear storytelling practices from his indigeneity, his culture, and it works most of the time, I find, but it does make it so that it pointed to me why I was interested in this memoir, which is not really his actual life. I wanted to know more about the oil sands in Alberta, which is where I live. Only a few hours north of here is where people work, and it's extremely detrimental to the land. The transatlantic pipeline, I think, is what it was called. It seems like it isn't happening anymore, but that was a big thing here. This person is a major activist. He is very well known in Canada for his opinions and his outspoken discourse, I guess, around these issues, and for not capitulating to like Canada's view of the situation regarding Indigenous people. And that's sort of what I wanted to get at with the memoir, and it kind of does and kind of doesn't get there because of the nonlinear storytelling. You'll get sections of that parceled out across every chapter. So within every chapter, I'll be reading things that I'm not really interested in, get to the point that I am, and then it will reframe it, which is a little bit annoying to me. But I didn't really want to know about his life in the gangs at such a granular level. I only got so much out of it because of the expectation that I had for it being framed by other people and blurbs and stuff like that, that it was particularly about his latter life, I guess, and his activism. But I would say that is only maybe a quarter of the book, so just be aware of that going in. Next, I read The Leavers. This was a really good book. I thought that it wouldn't resonate with me as much as it did, which is why I put it off until I was sort of like feeling like this again. I had been reading quite a lot of immigrant stories, especially consuming the Giller Prize and the Writers' Trust and some other Canadian stuff. And so I was a little burnt out on those. It feels like stories like this are somewhat oversaturated in Canada because publishers are very keen on marketing marginalized stories in a sort of touristic way of their being and experiencing pain, basically. And so I thought this would be kind of like that, but I find it very much more, I guess, literary than I expected, and much more broad and encompassing. We initially begin with the son, in which he states that his mother left him at a young age. He goes through this process, and then eventually he is adopted, he grows up, and it's basically his entire life of how that particular moment of his mother completely disappearing on him, essentially, affected his life. But then it alternates into the mother's perspective, in which these same sort of moments that are tinged or colored by her son are recontextualized to a very high degree. And anytime a story sort of interrogates or examines memory, especially from two sides in the same memories, I'm very interested in that, just because of how memory works and how my own memory works. And this does that very well. this book makes them both feel a lot more human and complex. And both of them make questionable, I guess, bad decisions, certainly, for their lives. But some of it is just an agency question in which society is somewhat dictating what they can and cannot do as Chinese immigrants, how they are treated by society, her upward mobility at her job, despite her being very active, very smart, and having ideas that would actually benefit the business quite a bit, are kind of dismissed, and as is her status, as is her personhood as a mother and as a woman just trying to have the American dream. It's a disillusionment story, but they both are very well realized. It is, as you might expect, a little bit of a downer book, but it feels very multifaceted and not as maybe emotionally manipulative. And it also shows just how humane they are in the sense of their poor decisions and their way that they treat other people, the sort of trickle-down effect of their marginalization, and again, their sort of frustration and genuine anger, which is warranted for what they can and cannot accomplish, as well as the unknowing of both of them to understand fully what has happened in each other's lives because of that separation and why it happened. And so as it continues on with the events in a linear way, you get a lot of payoff from this book, I feel. Next, I read Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This is a very well-loved book from what I can tell on BookTube. It is a Victorian novel. I read it for Cloak and Dagger Christmas. I have 3 books selected, which altogether hit all of the prompts, which is nice for me. This is about a young girl who's raised in a house of thieves, basically. They farm infants. They're not very good people. And they concoct a wild plan, or one of the people named Gentleman, who acts like a gentleman, whereas they do not, hatch a plan to wine and dine a very prominent, famous, and heiress, to wed Gentleman, then have her committed, and take all the spoils and run away type deal. It's like the one last job trope-ish kind of thing. And fingersmiths are pickpockets, of which she's fairly good, but her mother was a pickpocket that was caught and killed. So there's this overarching tension throughout the book that is, same thing may happen to her, especially because this is far outside the comfort zone. She is to pose as the handmaiden of the person and gain her trust, and then, gently push her towards Gentleman's way. And there's a lot of different things happening in this novel, but it is vaguely sapphic, and it is interesting in the way that it handles all of the female characters. I think it gives them quite a bit of agency while still holding them to account and making the consequences follow the actions. There's a lot of great dialogue. I especially like the voice, which is not particularly of literary expectations, I guess, but high contemporary maybe. Like, it's very overly stylized, and the verbosity and the verbiage, the diction overall is just like very pleasant to hear on the tongue. And so I alternated between the audiobook and this because it looks small, but it's actually 600 pages and it reads quite slowly for me, probably because of the sometimes flowery language, which I actually like. And it has quite a bit of turns, which I liked a lot. It's separated into different parts, which is generally more or less the point of views of each of the characters. And with each part, there's a sort of turning of the wheel, a reframe into specific events that happened in the past. as well as a like twistish thing that happens. It keeps things fresh, it keeps things interesting, and it's very enjoyable. It's like I would probably say it is a literary thriller, except that it's got contemporary language, so I'm not really sure how to, or contemporary craft work, I would say, so I'm not really sure how to classify it, but it's very fun. It's not quite as, I wouldn't recommend it as a genre-specific book because it actually is not too concerned with the conventions. Like, if you call this a thriller, people would be disappointed because the pages, while they read quite quickly, the chapters are not frenetic, and it's not afraid to dwell into like very rich moments, I would say, either, which slow down the pace, which actually is the kind of pacing that I generally prefer. But yeah, it was overall quite good. I did not like the ending. I thought it went on over long. And it was very preoccupied with finding a meta, almost substantive conclusion for every character, both big and minor, which I didn't really care about. I wanted to see the conclusion of the narrative tension, which felt like it was obfuscated for a different kind of tension near the end. If you know what I'm talking about, then you know. And that only worked for so long, and then it kind of had the last Lord of the Rings book where there could be like 12 ending points and we should have done one sooner. But it's also made me appreciate it. The Handmaiden, which is a Korean film that adapted this. And while this is a good book, I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. The Handmaiden is absolute masterpiece. I rated it 10 out of 10. And this book helped me appreciate that book more, because The Handmaiden absolutely uses every single plot beat that is important in this book and then recontextualizes it, makes it far more feminine, far more sapphic. It makes it more about fetishization and imperialism and a whole bunch of other things that really augment this story. But you can definitely appreciate them both in no matter what order that you consume them in, I think. Next, I read Unreconciled, Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance with Jesse Wente. I actually hadn't heard of this person, but I guess he's a predominant critic, and he seems like he's the person that put forward that Avatar was white saviorism and very offensive to Indigenous people for many different reasons, like putting on Indigenous skin and performing the role better than Indigenous people, which, yeah, like, I think that is generally an accepted critique of that movie now. And it seems like he's the one that put that forward, which is really interesting, because you always hear these like critiques of pop culture, yet you never really hear who has put them forward. Like, they're not attached to the name of the person, which is generally very important. But yeah, so that's what that made me think of. But this is his story. He's a person who went through university consuming a film degree, and then he talks about his experience in Canadian media and representation and his roles throughout that. He had a show that was quite big, I'm not sure if it's still going, where he was on the radio, and he would essentially talk about movies and TV shows and stuff like that. And he talks a lot about how he went from sort of trying to remove his indigeneity of his critiques, like the previous school of thought on critiquing is to remove your voice from it and always go at it as a craft perspective, similar to like old journalism and new journalism, basically. And how he started becoming a lot more realized and happier, basically, when he started inserting his own voice and talking about these issues with critical thought that was very intersectional to his identity, and not having to dismiss his anger or his feelings or his identity and his past as it relates to the things that he was talking about. And it really augments the pieces that he has done, which makes a lot of sense. I thought it was really fascinating. If you've read An Inconvenient Indian, I think it's called, the Thomas King book, there's a section in which he talks about film and the gross nature in which Hollywood has perpetuated tropes about indigeneity and indigenous people overall. That has been a harmful perpetuated trope that has disseminated into pop culture and is how racism often manifests. And for him, this, even as a boy, has happened to him, where people would cry war calls at him and stuff like that when he was playing basketball and shit like that. So he addresses that in far more detail than the King novel. So if you read that piece and you thought it was really interesting about like John Wayne playing a Native American and Indigenous people just not having roles in Hollywood to play themselves, or if they do, then it's very specific typecasting, this book is definitely for you. You should check it out. I thought it was a very effective way at confronting notions about racism or non-racist views within Canada that are actually racist as it relates to pop culture, because absolutely everybody who consumes this will probably have no accessibility issues at all. They'd be able to think about the things that he's talking about. They have an underlying general intellect about it, and then he can cut right to the issues. He's not preoccupied with the notions of what Westerners will bring to what he is saying. He uses the actual terms for things like white supremacy, genocide, residential school survivors, and things like that. All of the stuff he just talks about very bluntly and honestly, and I liked it a lot. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read the last installment of the Katherena Vermette Girl Named Echo books. This was not as strong to me. It's 3 stars for the conclusion. And the reason for that is that it wrapped up things in a very plotty kind of way, which is something I dislike and what we'll be coming to again soon. And it also kind of makes it confusing as to whether or not Echo has been going into the past in her imagination or not. Before, she'd be consuming the textbook, she'd fall asleep, she'd have a dream, and she'd be there. Whereas this is sort of trying to literalize the notion of generational trauma and generational memory in a way that she can sort of leap right into these moments if she would like to, in and out of. And it seemed odd because the rest of the story seemed to be going against that notion the entire time. But it does wrap up the Louis Riel arc of the story, and it does have some interesting things to say, but it does focus more on the Louis Riel than the Girl Named Echo part, and that is sort of what I wanted more closure on. I also read Dakwäkãda Warriors. I tried to go online and see how this is pronounced correctly, and found like 4 different versions of it, and even the umlaut seems to be either used or unused in some of them, so if I mispronounce that, forgive me. This is a young adult / middle grade book that's really interesting. I think it's got some great ideas. It's almost like what Afrofuturism is doing in comics right now for sci-fi graphic novels, in which they provide a very like futuristic contextualization of past cultures put into the future, in which they're directly opposed to colonization, and to provide a sort of fun context in which new people coming to the culture can consume things in bite-sized portions. In this, it has it through all of the dialogue and through the captions and stuff like that. 2 dialects appear in this, both of which are from the Yukon in Canada, and these dialects will have translations below the bubbles of when people are communicating to each other, so you have to translate them as you go, and so you end up learning the words. Overall, it is about Wolf and Crow, a futuristic and indigenous people who are sort of literalized as like Wolf and Crow type people in space adventures, who fight this like buccaneer pirate guy who's the colonizer, the white guy. And it gets pretty real sometimes, actually. The artwork was very interesting. They're combating their nemesis, basically, on this. And he makes, especially in the back, there's a little kind of essay about the ways he used the metaphor for residential schools and for other things. And it always relates back to the plot, which seems maybe bombastic and fun, but always has an undertone of retelling like an actual history. So I thought it was exceptional, very great. I gave it 4 stars. The artwork in particular wasn't for me, and some of the pages, it's actually very hard to translate some of the words because of the contrast. It'll be too dark or too light, and so you're kind of squinting trying to figure out what the words actually are. But otherwise it was great. Next, I read 3 books from Terry Pratchett. This is the only thing my library had. I was just looking for Hogfather for the readathon that I completed already, but is still ongoing over at Rewrite, Create with Katja, Scott at Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot, and Rosie Cockshut. So I ended up just reading them all because I thought maybe there's a reason it's a trilogy, right? Like maybe I needed more context, and most people know more about Discworld than I did. So the first one was Pyramids, which is the 7th Discworld book, and I thought overall the weakest. It does have some fun things going on with it, but in terms of when Pratchett is being a little bit outside of his comfort zone and basically engaging in cultural appropriation for laughs, this is like this to a T, basically. And I read some other reviews that said similar, so I think I'm on solid ground here. But he makes a pastiche of Greek and Egyptian culture in a way that makes it kind of clear that he doesn't always know what he is talking about, and its conflation is sometimes for a pun rather than a top-down subversive punching up kind of way. It feels a lot like punching down, and it feels like some of the historical figures, especially a trans woman, or what we would now classify as a trans woman, who identified as agender at the time. There's some gender essentialism that naturally comes into the text, and then with that punctuation of him misconstruing that historical figure, it really drives home that he doesn't know what he's talking about, basically. The overall story, though, I thought was fine. There's some jokes that landed, some that didn't, just like normal. It's about a guy who is the son of the pharaoh who is sent to assassin school, basically. And there's a particularly good sequence in which he has to take an exam, basically, like a task that he has to undergo in order to pass. And it's a very fun sequence. I like that. It was one of my favorites of the book, I think. Yeah, it was just really fun. But throughout it, there's his father dies, and a basically usurper kind of guy comes in and tries to take over the throne. It's very like Emperor's New Groove, basically. And he's trying to navigate old tradition and new tradition, and when that serves us and when it doesn't. I think the themes were fairly well good. There's a lot of mummy jokes, as you might expect. There's a sphinx that gives the riddle that everybody knows, and he circumvents in a very fun way. Although again, the talking sphinx, I believe, is from Greek culture, right? Egyptian culture didn't have a talking sphinx. So again, it's just kind of weird. But yeah, there's definitely sections of the book that I quite liked, and I definitely didn't hate it, but it definitely was cringe in some places. Small Gods, however, is probably my favorite Pratchett book now. It definitely took over Going Postal for me, just because the themes really hit. This is about a acolyte in a church-ish type place, an organized religion anyway, where he starts hearing voices, and it ends up being a turtle. The turtle ends up being or ostensibly anyway, a god in which he has, I think, been punished and reincarnated into a tortoise or something like that. Or maybe it's unclear forever why he was placed there, I'm not sure. But they go on a journey in which is trying to, emerge as a deity of note, especially because if nobody believes in him, then he just ceases to exist. And it goes into a lot of interesting territory about atheism, about organized religion. I really like the idea of essentially the acolyte is his last follower, despite there being a massive church of followers. They say that they believe in him, but in their practices and in the way that they pray and what praying is for, they show that they don't actually venerate or believe in they believe in aspects of recontextualizations of what he has said, which is very reminiscent of organized religion in my experience anyway. And it does this in a really nuanced way, I thought. It feels pretty complex. It feels like it is respectful of both sides, but makes points on both sides that are substantive, such that maybe both kind of miss the point of belief and what believing does for people and what it means to them, and why it is sort of a necessary function even when it goes awry with like organized religion. There's a major conflict at the end that I thought was resolved masterfully at a top-down sort of meta craft work and especially theme way. I thought this was the most resounding, successful book that I've consumed by Pratchett so far. I read Hogfather, which I gave 3 stars. Small Gods I gave 4, Pyramids I gave 3, and the collection I overall gave 3. Hogfather was a lot of fun. It's about essentially Saint Nick, right? The analogous Saint Nick anyway gets murdered, which is fun in its own way. Like, I don't mean like it's fun to imagine Santa Claus being killed, but the way in which he is killed or assassinated by the assassin Tea Time, which is just a fun name as well, is really interesting. And how he goes about it at a meta concept way, I guess, again, is very fun, I thought, and imaginative. It comes together way more than I thought it would at the end. The particular jokes and the particular like pop culture references and things like that I wasn't particularly down for in this one. It was less fun, but more of a fun romp, I guess, probably because I was just coming off a pretty phenomenal read with Small Gods. But I still found some stuff to like about it. I felt at a craft level it did succeed. It again goes into why it is necessary for people to believe in things, why that is necessary for society at a individual level, at a escapist kind of level, although not particularly hitting on that aspect as much as I would have liked, especially for a fantasy book. But Susan is a fantastic character. She is Death's granddaughter, I believe, and Death assumes the mantle or whatever of the Hogfather so that the season won't die, and he's trying to get across why he's doing this and why it's important and stuff like that, and people aren't very listening. He goes to a mall and starts giving away toys, and it's very like overly critical of a capitalistic system that seems like a foregone conclusion already. But probably at the time in like 1993 or whatever, it probably did hit a lot harder. And Susan was just MVP of this book in my opinion. Penultimately, I read the last Expanse book. I like this quite a bit. This series is one of my favorites. It would have to be to read 9 books and all of the small stories in between the novellas or whatever, making it like 15 or 16 books I've consumed by these guys now. This is a fine book in the installment, I imagine. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It's sort of a difficult thing because there's a lot of expectations in a finale like this, and so 3 stars in a sense is like resounding. Just the fact that they were able to tie a bow on things and make it navigate to a point where it was satisfying is a feat of in itself. But I did feel it was overly plotty, and it felt like it was showing its craft work too much for me. So there was a number of conflicts that feel like they were interjected precisely because it felt like we ought to have a conflict right then. And Tanaka, the antagonist of this one, feels kind of just fine. There was a lot of psychology, as they always do, put into her and why she functions the way that she does. But I still, for some reason, didn't find her that much of an interesting character. Probably because the stakes are so huge in the finale that it feels like a very not as interesting concept as it would have been going through the major motions of the plot, I guess. And again, there's like, yeah, all of the conflicts felt like a little bit manufactured until we got to the finale. There is some great character work. As always, the psychological profiles of everything is great. The tangential hard sci-fi aspects where it goes into some of the science of it is always fun. Some people codify these books as hard sci-fi and they're not. Like the main conceits that make this book work all are ones that are not based in science. Like it is impossible or unproven, etc. Hard sci-fi goes against that, so I don't really get that. It tries to be, its buttressing is in actual science, which is nice though and appreciated. I thought it was a decent send-off and otherwise quite fine. There is an epilogue in it that almost ruins it a little bit for me. It is kind of like glib and annoying, and it just didn't work for me. I think it'll hit different Expanse people one way or the other, and for me it was the other, I guess. But I am quite glad that I bought it, consumed it, and I think it is an ending that could have been so much worse. So they did do a good job with that aspect of it. And in general, this final sequence, this last trilogy, I guess, the last book was really great for me because I thought they were setting up some expectations for different things that they'd be going into, and they kind of swerved away from it in this book. So I was always sort of destined to not love this book because of that sort of beeline to the ending, basically. But for people that read the last book and weren't interested in those specific things, again, this could easily be like a 4 or 5 star read for them. And then lastly, I finished the audiobook of Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century by Alice Wong, the editor. It's a compilation of stories. This is a compilation of stories of own voices in the field or disabled themselves in some way. I thought it was great. I gave it 4 stars. This is exactly the kind of book that is for me, I think. Someone who is interested in but hasn't consumed that much about this. There's a lot of intersections with disability that I'm aware of, and I thought I was kind of up on it, to be honest, and this kind of pointed out to me that there's a whole bunch of them that I hadn't considered. As to the craft work in it, I listened to it on an audiobook in particular because I had heard that the writing is good to bad, basically, depending on the essay, which makes a lot of sense. I've been sold on the way that when people design to include disabled people into society, everybody benefits already. And I thought that this would go into that more, but I would say, again, it was more new issues or issues that I just hadn't fully considered. Like there's more context for it from the own voice, which makes sense. And so, yeah, for me, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. There's a couple things that I thought were odd, but also that I didn't think that I had enough knowledge to speak intelligently about. Even when things seemed problematized or something like that, I wouldn't know how to articulate it in a way that would be helpful or successful or anything anyway. So I think where I go from here is to read more reviews on this particular book and adjacent books that may handle this better or similarly or something like that. Basically, I just need to read more on the subject overall. The books that I'm going to be reading is, this is coming up soon, Loon. This is by a Dene guy named Henry S. Sharp, an anthropologist who lives in Charlottesville now, which is wild. And this is Memory, Meaning, and Reality. For that, I used to live on a reserve for 2 or 3 years, Dene Reserve, and my cousins lived there as well. And my cousin lent me this because I hadn't heard of it, and it sounds incredible. He describes it as like mind-blowing and very interesting, and rethinking, recontextualizing these notions through Indigenous lens. And apparently his other stuff is really great too, so I look forward to getting to it. I'm also ongoing with House of Leaves, of course. I don't have an update for this yet, because I'm planning on reading the additional 100 pages right after this, basically. And then finally I'm on the volume 2 of the Black Hammer oversized edition. I love these oversized editions. They're called library editions for Dark Horse. Sometimes they're just called oversized in general. And they're omnibuses pretty much always of trade paperbacks compiled into much bigger formats. It's such a fun way of consuming it. You wouldn't think it would be so different an experience, but it really is. So if you have the opportunity to pick up any of your favorite comic books in oversized edition, give it a shot and see if it works for you, because while it takes up a lot of space, the overall experience is much changed just from it being bigger, but the cardstock is usually different. It's a very luxurious and great experience. And that's it. That's my weekly reads. Let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of the stuff that I've talked about, feel free to put your comments in it or ask me questions or what have you. I'm at your disposal, and I'll see you next week.